In this presentation, I will focus on specific metals, talk about their toxic effects, and distinguish between essential elements and toxic metals. These 7 metals all produce multiple human health effects: arsenic, beryllium, cadmium, chromium, mercury, lead, and nickel. Arsenic is a metal that can be found in water. It's a naturally occurring element, and it can be found in water as well as other sources. It varies in toxicity depending on the form it's in, but it can also be a byproduct of metal processing, or like gold and other metals. It's used in pesticides. For many years, wooden playgrounds were preserved with arsenic, and it's used in other manufacturing processes. The main routes of exposure for arsenic are from ingestion of contaminated food or water and inhalation. In the early 2000s, the Environmental Protection Agency reduced the standard for arsenic in our drinking water to 10 micrograms per liter. All water supplies had to be in compliance or meeting this standard by 2006. It was lowered from 50 micrograms of arsenic per liter. This happened because of a major poisoning of lots of people in Bangladesh. Drinking water was contaminated. Wells were drilled to provide cleaner drinking water, and it turned out the wells were heavily contaminated with arsenic. This poisoning of people in Bangladesh has been considered one of the worst mass poisonings in history, and it was not intentional. The arsenic was naturally occurring. It was not clear that it was there until people started seeing the health effects. As a result, we have a lot of evidence about the impacts of arsenic on our health, and we know that no level of arsenic is safe. But the United States has set a standard of 10 micrograms per liter to achieve as much safety as we can afford. The list of health effects for arsenic is long. Cancers with skin, bladder, kidney. There's some evidence of lung cancer. We see vascular disease like cardiovascular disease. We believe that long-term exposure to arsenic is related to diabetes, as well as adverse pregnancy outcomes. Beryllium is often used because it's lighter than aluminum and stronger than steel. It's people most likely to be exposed are people that work in metal processing, and as a result, the metal becomes aerosolized in dust or other processes, and the most common route for people for beryllium is inhalation. It's a Class A carcinogen, which means that it's a known or probable carcinogen for humans. Cadmium is another toxic metal that one of the main sources for cadmium would be cigarette smoke and in the diet. It can bioaccumulate in shellfish and has been found in some species of mushrooms. Common routes for occupational exposure include metal production, like in nickel cadmium batteries, zinc smelting, paint. Some color pigments of paint are produced with heavy metals. Lead is a very good example. Cadmium is another one. Soldering, and from employment in metal factories. We know it can cause problems with osteoporosis in women, kidney damage, elevated blood pressure, cardiovascular disease. Chromium, which can be found naturally in the environment, like in soil or rock, is also a metal that we use in many industrial processes. Its common forms are chromium 0, 3, and 6. Chromium 6, or hexavalent chromium, is known as a carcinogen. Other forms of chromium aren't as toxic. Hexavalent chromium exposure was the topic of a movie almost 2 decades ago called Erin Brockovich. This was a story about a woman that advocated for a community to win against a manufacturing company, and they were contaminating a town's water supply. There were cancer clusters, and she helped the community win resources from that company. The health effects of being exposed to hexavalent chromium include digestive problems and organ damage, and there's some evidence that cancer can be caused from inhalation. Mercury is a metal that at room temperature is a liquid. It's naturally occurring, and it's often released into the environment as a byproduct of industrial processes. Coal-fired power plants, when coal is burned, does release some mercury into the air, but there are other major sources of mercury. It can be deposited into lakes and rivers, and at low levels it can bioaccumulate. Other things that can happen to mercury is it can be transformed by microorganisms through methylation, and that can make mercury more toxic. When mercury bioaccumulates, it can become more concentrated as it moves up the food chain. There are other examples of environmental contamination from industries where mercury was dumped into bays, and that caused major disease at really high levels. Minamata disease in Japan is one example, and mining environments where mercury is released into the environment in California is another. Lead is a heavy metal that we're fairly familiar with because of the recent stories about what happened in Flint, Michigan. Lead used to be included in gasoline. We can find it in pipes and in painted surfaces in older buildings. One of the most common sources of lead exposure that we aren't often thinking about is from pottery that's been imported from other places and hasn't been controlled for, and that pottery is being used in food service. Lead exposure causes central nervous system effects at low levels, and at high levels it can cause extreme illness and death. It's one of the most common environmental pediatric health problems in the United States, and although we've managed to dramatically reduce the level of lead in the environment by phasing out leaded gasoline and paint, Flint, Michigan highlighted to us some of the vulnerabilities that remain for populations at risk. Nickel is classified as a heavy metal, and it's part of the Earth's crust. Low levels of nickel exposure are likely common and unavoidable, but it is used in many products that we use, including batteries. Exposure to nickel can cause skin reactions, also known as contact dermatitis, and there's evidence of cardiovascular and renal diseases. It may also be potentially carcinogenic. There are some essential metals that our body needs to function, but at high levels can cause toxicity. These include copper, zinc, and iron. They're essential for human nutrition, but if in excessive amounts we get exposed to them, we can be ill. It's important to understand this optimal range and what happens if we exceed it. Copper is in electric wires, it's in pipes, it's used in lots of things to prohibit microorganisms from growing. However, it can be toxic and hazardous in the environment. Sources of exposure to copper include ingestion of copper-containing foods or water, direct contact with the skin, and inhalation. Small amounts can get into tap water from pipes, and it can also get more concentrated when the water remains in pipes overnight. We see respiratory and gastrointestinal problems with copper exposure, and very high levels can cause liver damage, kidney damage, and even death. Zinc is another element like nickel also found in the Earth's crust. It's therefore prominent in lots of different environmental media, air, soil, water, and in some foods. It's used as a coating to stop rust, and as components of batteries, and it's also an important nutritional element. However, in doses that are too high, that exceed what's helpful or therapeutic, we can see gastrointestinal problems, anemia, damage to pancreas, and in places where you might be working and get inhalation exposure, like zinc in a welding setting, you can get what's called zinc or metal fume fever. It's an immune response that starts in the lungs, but it feels like a flu. Iron, of course, one of the most common metals in the earth crust. It's vital to our health. It helps with transportation of oxygen in our blood through hemoglobin. But you can easily get poisoned with iron, and it's one of the most common poisonings for kids. Kids ingest, let's say, vitamins that have iron in it, and they ingest too many. Other people that are at risk from iron overload include men and women. There are some metals used to treat health problems, especially in the past, although perhaps some still today. These include aluminum, bismuth, gold, and lithium. Aluminum is used in food and beverage containers. It's also in some medicines and cosmetics, although we are concerned about its role with diseases like Alzheimer's disease.